Zeitoun, page 247, Sunday, September 11th. In the morning the door was opened and 4 men were added to their cell. All 4 were African American, between 30 and 45. Zeitoun and Nassar nodded to them in greeting, and with a quick choreography about who would sit where, the new residents found places in the tiny cell. 3 men sat widthwise on the bed and 3 on the floor against the wall, cramped and soaked in sweat. They rotated every hour. Zeitoun no longer harbored any expectation of being granted a phone call from any of the guards he had seen thus far. He pinned his hopes on seeing a new guard, a new employee of the prison, some visitor. He had no idea how the prison worked, how any prison worked, but he had seen movies where lawyers walked the cell blocks where visitors passed through. He needed to find someone like that, any one person from the world outside, someone who might grant one small mercy. The men in the cell told each other how they ended up at Hunt. All had been picked up in New Orleans after the storm. This entire wing of the prison, they said, held Katrina prisoners. We're all FEMA, one said. 2 of the men had been arrested for moving furniture in situations not unlike Zeitoun's. One man said he was a sanitation worker from Houston. His company had been contracted shortly after the storm to come in and begin the cleanup. One morning he was walking from the hotel to his truck when a National Guard truck pulled up. He was arrested on the spot, handcuffed, and brought to Camp Greyhound. It was his first time behind bars, and of all the prisoners doing Katrina time, as they'd termed it, he was the most perplexed by it all. He had, after all, come to New Orleans at the behest of his company. He usually picked up garbage in Houston, but after the hurricane, his supervisor said they had taken a contract in New Orleans. The prisoner, thinking it would be interesting to see what had become of the city and wanted to help in its cleanup, went willingly. He was in uniform and had identification, the keys to his truck, everything. But nothing worked. He was charged with looting and put in the cage behind the bus station. Another of the cellmates said he was a fireman in New Orleans. He stayed after the storm, just as he had been asked to stay. He was in his yard when he picked up by a passing Humvee. They charged him with looting, loaded him into the back, and brought him to the Greyhound. Zeitoun learned the most of those brought to Camp Greyhound had been arraigned in a more or less standard fashion. Most had been brought inside the bus station the morning after their arrest, and in an upstairs office a makeshift court had been arranged. There had been a judge and at least one lawyer. The arrestees were told their charges, and most of them were offered a deal. If they didn't contest the charges, they would be given a misdemeanor conviction and would be required to perform community service hours starting immediately. Some of those who took the bargain, thus accepting the permanent strike on their record, were promptly brought to the police station downtown, where they began repairing and repainting the damaged offices. A stabbing pain in his side, which Zeitoun had first felt at Greyhound, had now amplified tenfold. He felt like a long screw was being twisted slowly into his kidney. It was difficult to sit, to stand, to lay down. Wherever he switched positions, he would find relief for 5 minutes before the pain returned. He was not one to worry about such things. He had so many injuries over the years and rarely sought treatment, but this felt different. He thought of infections, the many diseases Kathy had mentioned when trying to get him to leave the city. He needed to find help. There was a nurse who came through the cell block once a day, pushing a cart full of medicine, handing pills to the prisoners. Zeitoun stopped her as she wheeled by. He told her about the pain. "Do you have a prescription?" she asked. He told her no, that the pain was new. "Then you need to see the doctor," she said. He asked how he could see the doctor. She told him to fill out a form describing his pain. The doctor would look at the form and then decide if Zeitoun needed attention. The nurse handed him the form and wheeled her cart down the hall. Zeitoun filled out the form. When she came back on her way out, he handed it to her. After dinner, Zeitoun's cellmates shared the stories they had heard from the other prisoners they encountered. The prisoners who had arrived at Hunt during the first day after the storm had lived through conditions beyond comprehension. The thousands from Orleans perished prisoner, including those who were in jail for public intoxication, shoplifting, and other misdemeanors, had been left on the city's Broad Street overpass for 3 days. They'd been on television, a sea of men in orange sitting on a roadway filthy with feces and garbage, surrounded by guards with automatic rifles. When buses finally arrived, the prisoners were taken to Hunt. Instead of being housed inside the prison, they were brought to the football stadium on the property. There they were held for days more outside without any kind of shelter. Thousands of prisoners, from murderers and rapists to DUIs and petty thieves, were thrown together on the stadium grass. There were no bathrooms. The prisoners urinated and defecated wherever they could. There were no pillows, sheets, sleeping bags, or dry clothing. The men were given one thin blanket each. The area on which Hunt had been built was marshland, and the ground grew wet during the night. The men slept on the mud with no protection against the elements, bugs, or each other. There were multiple stabbings. Men fought over blankets. Water was received through two small pipes extending from the grass. The men had to wait their turn and then drink from their hands for sustenance. Prison guards took sandwiches, fashioned them into balls, and threw them over the wall of the stadium and onto the field. Whoever caught one ate. Whoever could defend themselves ate. Many did not eat at all. None of the men in Zeitoun's cell knew whether or not these prisoners were still on the football field or what had become of them. Monday, September 12th. In the morning, the other 4 men were removed from the cell, and Zeitoun and Nasser were alone again. They had nothing to do but wait for any new face, anyone who might lead to recognition from the outside world that they existed there. The boredom was profound. They had been given no books, no paper, no radio. The 2 men could only stare at the gray walls, the black floor, at the baby blue bars, or at each other, but they feared talking too much. They assumed they were being monitored in some way. If a spy, Jerry, could be planted with them in an outdoor cage, it would be unsurprising if their conversations were being monitored here in a maximum security prison. Zeitoun sat against the bed and closed his eyes. He wanted only to pass these days. He recounted their arrest and the hours and days before it countless times, trying to figure out what had brought such attention to them. Was it simply the 4 men were occupying one house? Such a thing after a hurricane, when most of the city had been evacuated, was worthy of investigation, he conceded. But there had been no investigation. There had been no questions, no evidence seized, no charges leveled. Kathy often worried about the National Guard and other soldiers returning to the United States after time in Iraq and Afghanistan. She warned him about passing groups of soldiers in the airports, about walking near National Guard officers. "They're trained to kill people like you," she would say to Zeitoun, only half joking. She had not wanted their family to become a collateral damage in a war that had no discernible fronts, no real shape, and no rules. Almost 20 years earlier, he had been working on a tanker called the Andromeda. They had just brought Kuwaiti oil to Japan and returning to Kuwait for more. This was 1987, and Iran and Iraq were in the midst of their long and crippling war. Most of their own refineries had been destroyed during the fight, so both nations had come to rely on imported oil and routinely tried to blockade or damage any ships bringing oil to their enemy via the Strait of Hormuz. Zeitoun and his shipmates knew that entering the Gulf of Oman en route to the Persian Gulf meant risking the wrath of Iraqi or Iranian submarines and warships. The seamen were paid extra for the risk. Zeitoun's bunk was over the fuel tanks, and he was asleep one early morning when he jolted by an explosion below. He didn't know if it was one of the tanks or if the ship had struck something. He quickly realized that if the tank had exploded, he would be dead, so they must have hit something or had something hit them. He was rushing to the bridge to find out when another explosion shook the ship. They had been struck twice by Iranian torpedoes. Together they created a hole big enough to drive a small motorboat through. But it was clear the Iranians didn't mean to sink the tanker. If they had wanted to, that would have been quite easy. They wanted only to send a warning and to cripple the ship. They managed to make it to Aden, and there they spent a month repairing the hole. While waiting to ship out again, Zeitoun decided that perhaps his father, Muhammad, had been right. It was time to settle somewhere, a time to build a family, to remain safe and constant on land. A few months later, he got off the Andromeda in Houston and began searching for Kathy. Tuesday, September 13th. Zeitoun and Nasser did not discuss the possibility they would not be released from the prison for many months or even years, but they were both thinking that no one knew where they were, which afforded the authorities, whoever it was who wanted to be kept there, complete and unchecked power to keep them detained and hidden indefinitely. Zeitoun could think of no indication so far that any measure could be taken to advance his case. He was not allowed to make a phone call, and there was no hint that he would ever be allowed to do so. He had no contact with anyone from outside. There was the nurse, but she was a full-time employee of the prison. seeing his innocence to her was futile, as professions of innocence were likely all she heard all day. In fact, she knew that his very presence in a maximum security prison likely provided guilt in the minds of all who worked in the facility. The guards were used to overseeing men who had been convicted at trial. Further, the prison was so isolated that there was no oversight whatsoever, no civilians who came to check on conditions. He had not been let out of the cell block once, and had been let out of the cell only to shower. The shower itself had bars. If they had refused him a phone call for 7 days now, why would they change their policy in the future? He had one hope, which was to impart his name and innocence to every prisoner he might meet, so that in the event that one of them was someday released, they might not only remember his name, but also bother to call Kathy or tell someone where he was. But again, who among them would believe he was one of the true innocents in the prison? How many other names and promises had they known and made? When he was originally arrested, Zeitoun had not been sure his country of origin had anything to do with his capture. After all, 2 of the 4 men in their group were white Americans and born in New Orleans. But the rest had taken on an entirely different cast by the time they were brought to Camp Greyhound, and though he was loath to make this leap, was it improbable that he, like so many others, might be taken to an undisclosed location, to one of the secret prisons abroad, to Guantanamo Bay? He was not the sort to fear such things. He was not given to conspiracy theories or believing that the U.S. government willfully committed human rights violations. But it seemed every month another story appeared that a native of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Syria, or any other of a number of other Muslim countries, who was released after months or years from one of these detention centers. Usually the story was similar. A Muslim man came to be suspected by the U.S. government, and under the president's current powers, U.S. agents were allowed to seize the man from anywhere in the world and bring him anywhere in the world without ever having to charge him with a crime. How different was Zeitoun's current situation? He was being held without contact, charges, bail, or trial. Would it not behoove the Department of Homeland Security to add a name to their roster of dangerous civilians? In the minds of some Americans, the very thought of 2 Syrians paddling through New Orleans together after a hurricane could seem suspicious enough. Even the most amateur propagandists could conjure sinister implications. Zeitoun did not entertain such thoughts lightly. They were against everything he knew and believed about his adopted country. But then again, he knew the stories. Professors, doctors, and engineers had all been seized and disappeared for months and years in the interest of national security. Why not a house painter? Wednesday, September 14th. The pain in Zeitoun's side was overtaking him. While standing or sitting in certain positions, he could barely breathe. He had to get help. When he heard the nurse's cart making its way down the cell block, he jumped up to meet her at the bars. "Did you give the doctor my form?" he asked her. She said she did, and she would hear back soon. "You look sick," Nassar said. "I know," Zeitoun said. "You've lost too much weight. The pain, it's so bad now." Zeitoun had sudden and strange thought that the pain in his side could be caused not by infection or injury, but by sorrow. Maybe there was a medical reason for it. Maybe it was just the manifestation of his anger and sadness and helplessness. He did not want any of this to be true. He did not want it to be true that his home and his city were under water. He did not want it to be true that his wife and children were 1,500 miles away and might by now presume him to be dead. He did not want it to be true that he was now and might always be a man in a cage, hidden away, no longer a part of the world. Thursday, September 15th. Now Zeitoun knew the rhythmic ticking of the nurse's cart like his own heartbeat. He leapt to the bars again to meet her. "What did the doctor say?" he asked. "About what?" she said. "About my conditions," he said. "You gave him the form?" "Oh, I don't think he got it. You better fill it out again," and she said, and she handed him another form. He did not see her again that day or the next. Zeitoun began to feel faint when he rose to his feet. He was not eating enough. It seemed that every meal had pork at its center, and even when he could eat what was offered, he was often too agitated or despondent to do so. After lunch, 3 guards arrived. The gate to the cell opened, and they entered. Zeitoun was handcuffed, and his legs were shackled, and he was let out from the cell. He was walked to another building, and was put into another empty cell. Now he was alone. He and Nassar had not spoken much, for the contrast in being alone was stark. Zeitoun tried to remember how much his life insurance policy was worth. He should have bought a larger one. He had not thought hard enough about it. The woman at Allstate had tried to convince him to insure his life for more than $1 million, given that he had 4 children and how much the business relied on him, but he could not envision his death. He was only 47, too early to contemplate life insurance, but he knew that by now Kathy would have checked the value of the policy. She would have begun to imagine a life without him. When he pictured his wife having to make such plans, presuming him to be dead, his heart raged. He had wrathful thoughts about the police who had arrested him, the jailers who kept him here, the system that allowed this. He blamed Ronnie, the stranger who had come to the house on Claiborne, whom he didn't know and couldn't account for, whose presence might very well have brought suspicion upon all of them. Maybe Ronnie was guilty. Maybe he had done something wrong. He cursed Nassar's bag of cash. What a fool. He should never have been carrying around money like that. Kathy, Zachary, the girls might grow up without a father. If Zeitoun was transferred to a secret prison, their lives would be reversed completely. They would go from the well-off children of a successful man to the disgraced children of a presumptive sleeper cell mastermind. And even if he got out tomorrow or next week, their father had now been in prison. The scarring was inevitable. To live in fear of their father's death and then to find out he had been taken to prison or at gunpoint, made a prisoner, made to live like a rat. He clutched his sigh, pushing back at the pain, trying to contain it. Friday, September 16th. The news came down to the prisoners that after lunch they would be allowed to go outside. It had been a week since Zeitoun had seen the sun. During the hour they were allowed in the yard, Zeitoun tried to jog, but felt lightheaded. He walked around the yard, overhearing one bewildered story after another. He met a man who said he was moving furniture in his house just after the storm hit. The police spotted him and broke in. When he protested his innocence, they beat him up and left. A few days later, he came to the Greyhound station to complain. They arrested him and sent him to Hunt. No story was more absurd than the tale of Merlene Matten, one of the prisoners who had just seen her story on TV. She had been held next door at Hunt's sister prison for women. Matten was 73 years old, a diabetic, and a deaconess at the Resurrection Mission Baptist Church. Before the storm, she and her husband, who was 80, had checked into a hotel downtown, knowing that they would be among other residents and guests. They would have access to help if they needed it, and it would be safer, given that the hotel was on high ground. They drove to the hotel in the car and paid for the room with their credit card. They had been at the hotel for 3 days when Matten went downstairs to get some food from their car. Mayor Nagin had told everyone in the city they had to have 3 days' food on hand, and she had duly packed enough into the car to last. The car was parked in the lot next to the hotel, and Matten had left a cooler inside full of the foods her husband liked. She retrieved a package of sausages and was walking back to the hotel when she heard yelling and footsteps. It was the police, and they accused her of looting a nearby store. The nearby check-in, check-out deli had been looted, and the police were looking for anyone who might have benefited. They found Matten. She was handcuffed and charged with stealing $63.50 worth of groceries. Her bail was set by a judge calling by phone at $50,000. The usual bail for a misdemeanor would be $500. She was brought to Camp Greyhound, where she slept on the concrete. Then she was brought to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, Hunt's sister prison, for more than 2 weeks. She was finally freed with the help of the AARP volunteer lawyers, a private attorney, and an article about her plight published by the Associated Press. The lawyer finally convinced a judge that a septuagenarian staying at a hotel would not need to loot a store for sausages. They proved that the store did not even sell the sausages she was carrying. Matten had never been in the store. Furthermore, to have ever entered the damaged store, strewn everywhere with debris and broken glass, would have required an agility that she did not possess. In the late afternoon, Zeitoun heard a group of guards enter the cell block. He couldn't see them, but it sounded like at least 4 or 5 men. A cell down the hall rattled open. The guards yelled and cursed, and there was some kind of scuffle. Then quiet for a few minutes, and then the cell closed shut again. The process repeated itself half a dozen times. Then it was his turn. First he saw their faces, 5 men on the other side of the blue bars. He had seen one of the guards before, but the other 4 were strangers. They were all wearing black riot gear, dressed like a SWAT team. They had shields, padding, batons, helmets. They waited the ready for the door to open. Zeitoun was determined not to struggle. He would not present any appearance of opposition. When the cell door slid open, he slid He stood in the center of the floor, his hands in the air, his eyes level. But still the men burst in as if he were in the process of committing a murder. Cursing at him, 3 men used their shields to push him to the wall. As they pressed his face against the cinder block, they handcuffed his arms and shackled his legs. They brought him into the hallway. 3 guards held him while the other 2 ransacked the cell. They threw open the bedding, overturned the mattress, scoured the tiny room. 2 of the guards blocked Zeitoun's handcuffs and shackles. "Take off your clothes," one said. He hesitated. He had not been given underwear when he arrived at Hun, so if he took off his jumpsuit, he would be naked. "Now," the guard said. Zeitoun unzipped the jumpsuit and pulled it off his shoulders. It dropped to his waist, and he pushed it to the floor. He was surrounded by 3 men fully dressed in black riot gear. He tried to cover himself. "Bend over," the guard said. Again he hesitated. "Do it," Zeitoun complied. "Farther," the guard said. "Grab ankles." Zeitoun could not tell who was inspecting him or how. He expected something to enter his rectum at any moment. "Okay, get up," the guard said. They had spared him this one indignity. Zeitoun stood. The guard used his foot to slide Zeitoun's jumpsuit back to the cell and then pushed Zeitoun into. While Zeitoun was putting on his clothes, they backed away from him, shields up and out of the cell. Zeitoun's door closed, and the guards assembled themselves at the next cell, ready for the next prisoner. From the other prisoners, Zeitoun learned that these searches were common. The guards were looking for drugs, weapons, any contraband. He should expect such a procedure every week. Saturday, September 17th. Zeitoun lay in bed much of the day, racked by fatigue. He had not slept. He had run the strip search through his mind most of the night, trying to erase all memory of it, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the men in their riot gear at the other side of the cell door, waiting to flood in and take him. For weeks it seemed he had been stealing hours of sleep during the day, a few at night. He could not remember the last time he had strung more than 3 hours of rest together. Why had he done this to his family? There was something broken in the country. This was certain, but he had begun all this. He had refused to leave the city. He had stayed to guard his property, to watch over his business. But then something else had overtaken him, some sense of destiny, some sense that God had put him there to do his work, to glorify him with good deeds. It seemed ridiculous now. How could he have been guilty of such hubris? He had put himself in harm's way, and by doing so had put his family in danger. How could he have not known that staying in New Orleans, a city under something like martial law, would endanger him? He knew better. He had been careful for so many years. He had kept his head low. He had been a model citizen. But in the wake of the storm, he'd come to believe he was meant to help the stranded. He believed that the damned canoe had given him the right to serve as shepherd and savior. He had lost perspective. He had expected too much. He had hoped too much. The country he had left 30 years ago had been a realistic place. There were political realities there, then and now, that precluded blind faith, that discouraged one from thinking that everything always would work out fairly and equitably. But he had come to believe that such things in the United States, things had worked out, difficulties had been overcome. He had worked hard and achieved success. The machinery of government functioned. Even if in New Orleans this machinery was sometimes slow or poor engineered, generally it functioned. But now nothing worked, or rather every piece of machinery, the police, the military, the prisons, that was meant to protect people like him was devouring anyone who got close. He had long believed that the police acted in the best interests of the citizens they served, that the military was accountable, reasonable, and was kept in check by concentric circles of regulations, laws, common sense, common decency. But now those hopes could be put to rest. The country was not unique. This country was fallible. Mistakes were being made. He was a mistake. In the grand scheme of the country's blind, grasping fight against threats, seen and unseen, there would be mistakes made. Innocents would be suspected. Innocents would be imprisoned. He thought of bycatch. It was a fishing term that they'd used it when he was a boy. Fishing for sardines by the light of the moon they'd made. When they pulled in the net, there were thousands of sardines, of course, but there were other creatures too, life they had not intended to catch and for which they had no use. Often they would not know until too late. They would bring their catch back to shore, a mound of silver, the sardines dying slowly. Zeitoun, exhausted, would rest against the bow, watching the fish slowly cease their struggles. And once on shore, when the crew unloaded the nets, they would sometimes find something else. One time there was a dolphin. He always remembered this dolphin, a magnificent ivory white animal shining on the dock like porcelain. The fishermen nudged it with their feet, but it was dead. It had gotten caught in the net, and unable to reach the surface to breathe, it had died underwater. If they had noticed it in time, they could have freed it, but now all they could do was throw it back into the Mediterranean. It would be a meal for bottom feeders. The pain inside inside was growing, rippling outward. He could not stay here another week. He would not survive the heartbreak, the wrongfulness of it. There was no way to come out of this prison improved. Not the way he was being treated. He had seen parts of Hunt that seemed well run, clean, efficient. When he first arrived and was being processed, he saw prisoners milling about freely in a grassy courtyard, but he had been confined 23 hours a day in his cell with no distractions, no companionship or beauty. The environment would drive any sane man mad. The gray walls, the blue bars, the strip searches, the showers behind bars, watched by guards and cameras, the lack of any mental stimuli, unable to work, to read or build or improve himself, he would waste away here. He had risked too much in the hopes that he might do something to match the deeds of his brother Mahmud. No, it had never been a conscious part of his motivation. He had done what he could in the drowned city because he was there. It needed to be done, and he could do it. But somewhere in his gut was there not some hope that he too could bring pride to the family, as Mahmud had so many years ago? Was there not some wish that he might honor his brother, his family, his God, by doing all he could, by circling the city looking for opportunities to do good, and by this imprisonment God's way of curbing his pride, tempering his vainglorious dreams? As the prisoners awoke with their rantings and threats, Zeitoun prayed. He prayed for the health of his family. He prayed that they felt at peace, and he prayed for a messenger. All he needed was a messenger, someone to tell his wife that he was alive, someone to connect him with a part of the world that still worked.